Welcome back, viewers. Today on Talking Points, we continue mourning and talking about the brutal killing of the journalist in Yaoundé, Martinez Zogo. And our guest tonight on Talking Points is Angela Quintal. She is the Africa coordinator of a committee to protect journalists. She is based in the United States of America, precisely in New York. Thank you, Angela, for accepting to be our guest tonight. You head a committee to protect journalists, which is the CPJ, and you had a communique, or you sent out a communique after Martinez Zogo was kidnapped and finally killed, condemning that gruesome act. You, as the head of a community to protect journalists in Africa, though you're based in the US of A, what is your appraisal of press freedom in Cameroon, a country you know so well?
The Committee to Protect Journalists is obviously very concerned about the state of press freedom in Cameroon. Over the years, we have documented a marked deterioration of press freedom, and we certainly saw an uptick in violations at the start of the Anglophone conflict. We've had several journalists in and out of jail, and currently we have 5 journalists who remain in jail, making Cameroon the second worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. The fact that there are 5 journalists in Cameroon, the majority of them dating back to late 2016 and early 2017, also shows that Cameroon is the one country after Eritrea in Africa where journalists are serving the longest in prison. There are other issues, obviously, to be concerned about in terms of press freedom. That relates to the fact that journalists are murdered with impunity. So we have the latest case of Martinez Zogo, who we know has been killed in a terrible, terrible, shocking way. And we call on authorities to ensure that there is no impunity, that his murderers are held to account. It is not as though there are not signs of who may be behind his murder. And so we need to see fast and swift arrests. Unfortunately, the conduct of government when it comes to the investigations of the killing of journalists or journalists who have died in custody, like Samuel Wazizi, is not very good. And so that impunity that we talk about, which does have a chilling effect on other journalists, is obviously something of great concern for the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Yeah, Angela, you just mentioned there that Cameroon is one of the worst jailers in Africa, the 4th. And now you heard the CPJ, which is a committee to protect journalists. How can you qualify the gruesome killing of Martinez Zogo, and what are some of the steps or the measures the CPJ on its part has been putting in place to ensure that journalists in Africa, Cameroon in particular, are protected and in security?
Yeah, and this is our methodology. On December the 1st, we look at how many journalists are in jail around the world, and on that basis, we are able to rank the countries that we regard as the worst jailers. Since 2014, Cameroon has appeared on CPJ's list. It is quite ironic, for example, that someone who was on our list in 2014, a journalist at the time, is now a lawyer and is actually the defense lawyer for one of the journalists, Kingsley Njoka, who continues to be detained. All the journalists, bar that of Amadou Vamuke, are actually being held in connection to anti-state charges. And certainly within the United Nations, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, there is a sense that these journalists are arbitrarily detained, and there have been calls that CPJ has echoed for years that these journalists should be released.
And he just mentioned too, Angela, that journalism seems to be becoming a crime recently in Cameroon. What is the CPJ saying about that? Because it looks like journalists in Cameroon are totally, or 80% of journalists in Cameroon are insecure. What is the CPJ doing about that? Coming back to my last question, in other words.
There is no need to keep journalists in jail for their work, and that is what essentially the government has done. It has silenced journalists by jailing them because they believe that they are critical or do not toe the government line in terms of their thinking. And so it is important, as a show of goodwill, that the journalists are released. A journalist does not belong behind bars. Journalism is not a crime.
You've mentioned about 2 times in your responses, Angela, that Cameroon is the 4th worst jailers in Africa. What can be the basis of that finding or of that ranking?
I think that it is important, certainly in our advocacy efforts, to ensure that journalists are released, that governments and themselves, but also the wider international community, understands where a government stands. And so it has an effect, obviously, even in terms of the image of a country. When it is known as one of the worst jailers of journalists, obviously it has a knock-on effect. And so it is not a record to be proud of. And that one would hope that Cameroon will do the right thing and use this opportunity now that there is to ensure that the journalists are in fact released, but also to show that journalists are not killed with impunity in Cameroon. So our call is for the government of Cameroon to act swiftly to ensure that there is an independent, transparent, and credible investigation into Martinez Ogo's murder, brutal murder, that those who ordered and executed the killing are held to account, that no one escapes justice in this sense.
Angela, my last question before we part company, do you think that ranking can instigate the governments to take a glance and get serious with the protection of journalists in Cameroon after the brutal killing of Martinez Zogo, and your findings?
In relation to what happened to Samuel Wazizi, the fact that he died in custody, that his family have yet to receive his body, that there has not been a credible, transparent inquiry by the government into his death. Certainly, what we have seen so far has not been good enough. And if anything, it should be independent and actually have international input in terms of a proper investigation, so that those who were party to what happened to Samuel Wazizi, because he was held, it was an enforced disappearance. I mean, it's not as though CPJ did not try to ensure that we found out what happened. We were in court. We, with our partners, had various court applications trying to ensure that authorities handed him over. And the fact that they only announced a year after he had actually died in their custody that he had in fact been killed, I think says more about what actually happened. The truth about the fact that he died in custody and, as we suspect, was tortured and killed in custody than it does to the fact that this was someone who simply died of sepsis. If there was nothing to hide, we would not have had the sort of silence. We would not have had the family still waiting for his body to be handed over.